Jack Callahan stood paralyzed on his own deck as the iron teeth of a construction crane tore the rusty anchor's sign from its hinges, snapping the salt-rotted wood like a dry bone. Behind him, the man he had called a brother for 20 years clutched a briefcase of blood money and refused to look him in the eye. "I'm a trespasser," Jack whispered, staring at the legal deed in the corporate lawyer's hand. A document bearing his partner's original signature next to a secret gambling debt that had just cost them everything. The festival crowd screamed as a frying station overturned, sending a wall of scalding oil and fire roaring toward the kitchen where Jack stood cornered by 3 suits. He didn't reach for a fire extinguisher. He gripped a heavy iron gaff, his knuckles white and slick with fish blood and hydraulic fluid. As the first blow landed and the smell of ozone filled the air, Jack realized the corporate shark leading the raid wasn't a stranger. It was the boy he'd taught to fish 30 years ago. He had 1 hour to prove the mayor was a traitor or lose the only home he'd ever known to a pile of rubble and a lie. The knife bit into the cod's belly with a wet thunk, scales flaring silver under the dock lights. Jack's fingers worked fast, gutting the fish before the blood could pool on the cutting board. Salt stung the cracks in his knuckles the same way it had for 20 years. Ever since he'd first stepped onto the rusty anchor at 16, lying about his age to Captain Hargrove. The sea never cared about lies. It only cared about hands that didn't shake. A gull screamed overhead, wheeling too close. Jack flicked a scrap of offal into the air. The bird snatched it mid-dive, wings beating like a drum against the pre-dawn quiet. The dock groaned under his boots as he shifted, the wood slick with last night's rain. Somewhere beyond the harbor, a trawler's engine coughed to life, the sound carrying over the water like a warning. He wiped his blade on his thigh, leaving a dark streak on the faded denim. The first light bled through the clouds, turning the waves the color of old pennies. Jack exhaled through his nose, watching his breath curl in the cold. Another day, another catch. The rhythm of the work was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Each slice of the blade was a testament to survival, a mechanical prayer offered to the Atlantic. He didn't think about the bills or the way the wood of the piers seemed to sag more every year. He focused on the silver-gray skin of the cod, the weight of the steel in his palm, and the familiar, bracing stench of brine. The harbor was waking up, a slow, grinding process of metal on metal and the low-frequency thrum of diesel engines. Jack's world was small, defined by the reach of his arms and the sharpness of his edge. He worked alone, preferred it that way. Silence was a luxury in Gloucester, one usually reserved for the dead or those far out at sea. Here, on the edge of the world, he was the master of this small, bloody kingdom. The morning peace shattered when a shadow stretched across the planks, long and thin like a needle. Jack didn't turn, but he felt the change in the air. A shift from the honest smell of salt to something synthetic, something polished. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit stood there, clutching a leather portfolio as if it were a shield. He looked out of place among the fish guts and the diesel fumes, his shoes already stained by the muck of the docks. Jack kept his head down, the knife moving with surgical precision. He knew this type. They didn't come to buy fish or share a drink. They came to take. The man cleared his throat, the sound thin and nervous against the backdrop of the crashing waves. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a folded paper, the white stark against the gray morning. "Jack Callahan?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Jack finally stopped, the knife buried deep in the wood of the cutting board. He turned slow, his storm cloud eyes fixing on the intruder. The man flinched, but held his ground, extending the paper. "I'm looking for Jack Callahan. You've been served. It's a foreclosure notice for the rusty anchor. You have 30 days to vacate or settle the outstanding arrears." Jack didn't reach for the paper. Instead, he felt a heat rising in his chest, a slow boiling rage that had been simmering for years. This shack was more than wood and nails. It was his father's ghost, his own blood, the only thing that kept his feet on solid ground. He looked at the man's soft hands, hands that had never hauled a net or gutted a fish. Without a word, Jack stepped forward, the dock groaning under his weight. He grabbed the man by the lapels of his cheap suit, the fabric bunching under his calloused grip. The process server's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open in a silent plea. "You think you can just pin a piece of paper to my life?" Jack's voice was a low, dangerous rasp, the sound of an anchor chain dragging across stone. "You think numbers on a page drown a man faster than the sea?" He didn't wait for an answer. With a sudden, explosive heave, he shoved the man backward. The server stumbled, his arms flailing, and with a loud, ungraceful splash, he disappeared into the frigid, oily water of the harbor. The white paper fluttered through the air like a dying bird before landing on the surface, the ink beginning to bleed into the brine. Jack watched him surface, sputtering and gasping, before turning back to his cutting board. The message was delivered, but the weight of it remained, heavy as a lead sinker in his gut. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and stale coffee. Jack sat at the small, scarred desk in the back office, the light from a single flickering bulb casting long, jagged shadows. He pulled a stack of crumpled ledgers and stained receipts toward him, his hands shaking slightly. The numbers were a disaster. The bank account was a hollow shell, the balance so low it was practically an insult. Every month was a desperate scramble, a race against the tide that he was finally losing. The debt had grown into a monster, fed by bad seasons and the rising cost of fuel. He leaned back, the chair creaking in protest. The Gloucester Lobster Festival was only 24 hours away. It was the biggest event of the year, a chaotic swarm of tourists with deep pockets and an endless appetite for seafood. If, and it was a massive if, he could pull off a record-breaking weekend, he might just find enough cash to keep the bank's dogs at bay. It was a fool's bet, a last-ditch effort to keep the rusty anchor afloat, but he had nothing else left. He looked at the photo of his father on the wall, the old man smiling in front of a record catch. "I am not losing this," Jack whispered to the empty room. "I am not letting go." The sound of a truck's engine, coughing and sputtering, announced Eli Turner's arrival. It was nearly 2 hours past their scheduled start, a delay that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Eli stepped out of the battered blue F-150, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His dark blonde hair was a greasy mess, and his fox-like face was shadowed with a thick, uneven stubble. He didn't look at Jack. He didn't even say hello. He just started hauling crates toward the boat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "You're late," Jack said, his voice level but hard. He watched Eli's hands. They were twitching, tapping a restless rhythm against the side of a plastic crate. Eli grunted, a non-committal sound that didn't explain anything. There was a wall between them now, one built of secrets and unspoken fears. They had been partners for 2 decades, surviving storms that would have swallowed lesser men, but now they were drifting apart in the calm. Eli's pale blue eyes darted everywhere, at the horizon, at the water, at his own boots, never settling on Jack's face. The silence was a physical weight, more suffocating than any fog. "Engine's acting up again," Jack muttered, more to the air than to Eli. "Need the big wrench from your truck, the one with the rusted handle." He didn't wait for a response, heading toward the F-150. Eli made a sudden, aborted movement, as if to stop him. but then froze, his face going a sickly shade of gray. Jack didn't notice. He was focused on the task, his mind already calculating the cost of a new fuel line if the patch didn't hold. He reached into the cab of the truck, pushing aside a mountain of fast food wrappers and crumpled receipts. His hand brushed against something smooth and heavy, tucked under the passenger seat. It wasn't a wrench. Jack pulled it out. A thick, professional-looking folder made of high-quality cardstock. It felt wrong in the cluttered, salt-stained interior of the truck. He opened it, and the first thing he saw was the sleek, predatory logo of Atlantic Harvest. His heart did a slow, heavy roll in his chest. Below the logo was a signed letter of intent. The signatures at the bottom were clear. A corporate representative he didn't recognize, and Eli Turner. The words blurred before his eyes, but the meaning was unmistakable. Eli was selling the rusty anchor. He was selling the legacy, the wood, the brine, and Jack's life along with it. The betrayal was a physical blow, a cold blade between the ribs. Jack stood there in the gravel, the folder trembling in his hands. He looked up and saw Eli watching him from the dock, his silhouette small and hunched against the rising sun. The man he had called a brother for 20 years had been negotiating with the very sharks that were circling their home. He turned the page, his eyes catching on a series of spreadsheets. He wasn't a businessman, but he knew the value of waterfront property in Gloucester. Atlantic Harvest was offering a pittance. They were lowballing Eli, using falsified property values and manipulated market data to make the shack look like a liability rather than an asset. They were stealing it, and Eli was letting them. Jack's thumb rubbed the edge of the paper, his jaw tightening until it ached. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was cold. A deep, crystalline clarity settled over him. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, pulled onto the gravel lot, crunching the stones under its expensive tires. A man stepped out, looking like he'd been assembled in a boardroom. Silver hair, a tailored suit that didn't have a single wrinkle, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. This was Mr. Sterling. He walked toward the dock with a measured, predatory grace, ignoring the smell of fish and the muck on the planks. He stopped in front of Jack and Eli, steepling his long, pale fingers. "Mr. Callahan, Mr. Turner," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sharp contrast to the rough environment. "I believe we have business to conclude. The offer from Atlantic Harvest is on the table, but it won't stay there forever. The bank is losing patience, and so am I. Sign the final documents now, and we can make this transition painless. Refuse, and I can promise you that the next 30 days will be the most difficult of your lives." He looked at Jack, a small, tight smile playing on his lips. "You are fighting the tide, Jack, and the tide always wins." Jack stared at him, a flicker of memory sparking in the back of his mind. He looked past the expensive suit and the silver hair, focusing on the sharp angle of the jaw and the way the man held himself. He remembered a younger version of this man, 25 years ago, standing on these same docks in a tattered flannel shirt. "Bill?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Bill Sterling? You were Old Man Miller's deckhand. You swore you'd never leave the water. You sat at my father's table and talked about protecting this place from the developers." Sterling's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went even colder. "That was a long time ago, Jack. A different life. I learned that the water doesn't pay the bills, and loyalty doesn't buy a future. I grew up. I suggest you do the same." The recognition was the final straw. This wasn't just a corporate takeover, it was a personal desecration. A man who knew the value of the salt was now the one trying to poison the well. Jack looked at Eli, who was staring at his feet, then back at Sterling. "Get off my dock," Jack said, the words heavy and final. "Get off my dock before I put you in the water with your process server." As Sterling turned back toward his car, his movement still precise and unbothered, Jack felt the weight of the war he was now in. The Lobster Festival wasn't just a chance to save the business. It was a battle for the soul of the waterfront. He looked at the folder in his hand, then at the retreating black sedan. He knew Sterling's weaknesses because they were the same as his own, or they used to be. The fight for the rusty anchor had become a personal vendetta, a war of ghosts and greed, and the first shot had already been fired. The next morning, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the anticipatory hum of the festival. But the peace was shattered by the arrival of two men who looked like they'd been carved out of granite. They wore black tactical gear with the Atlantic Harvest logo embroidered on the chests. Vince, the leader, had a buzz cut and a scar that ran like a lightning bolt from his temple to his jaw. They didn't ask for permission. They simply marched onto the pier, carrying clipboards and digital cameras. "Property inspection," Vince barked, his voice a low mechanical rumble. "Ordered by the majority debt holder. We're here to document the state of the assets." They started moving through the shack with a calculated, destructive efficiency. They overturned crates of empty bottles, kicked aside stacks of weathered buoys, and took photos of every crack in the foundation. Jack watched them from the counter, his knuckles white as he gripped a cast-iron skillet. He wanted to fight, but he knew that was exactly what they wanted. They were looking for a reason to call the police, to shut him down before the first customer arrived, while Vince was busy documenting the dilapidated state of the back office. The second man, a silent bruiser with dead eyes, slipped behind the shack. Jack was distracted, arguing with Sterling, who had returned to oversee the inspection. He didn't see the man pull a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters from a holster. He didn't hear the sharp snip of the copper coolant lines or the hiss of escaping gas as the refrigeration unit for the main walk-in cooler was bled dry. It was a surgical strike designed to ruin the thousands of dollars of lobster stock Jack had spent his last cent to secure for the festival. It wasn't until an hour later that Jack noticed the change. The familiar, low-frequency hum of the compressor had shifted to a strained, metallic whine. He opened the heavy wooden door of the cooler and was met not by a blast of frigid air, but by a damp, lukewarm stillness. His heart plummeted. He checked the thermometer. 55 degrees and rising. "Eli!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Eli, get the tools, now!" He dove behind the unit, his hands frantically searching for the source of the leak, his mind racing through the inventory. If the temperature hit 60, the entire stock would be trash by noon. He found the severed lines, the cuts clean and deliberate. Rage flared in his chest, hot and blinding, but he forced it down. He didn't have time for anger. He needed to be a mechanic. He started stripping wires, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, trying to bypass the damaged sensors and force the pump to stay alive. It was a desperate makeshift repair, a patchwork of electrical tape and hope. He was sweating despite the ocean breeze, the salt stinging his eyes as he worked in the cramped, oily space behind the shack. Eli stood 10 feet away, frozen. He looked at the severed lines, then at Jack, then at the Atlantic Harvest thugs who were leaning against their truck, watching with smug indifference. Eli didn't move. He didn't offer a wrench or a hand. He just stood there, his watery blue eyes wide with a mix of terror and shame. He was a man hollowed out by his own choices, paralyzed by the realization that he was the one who had opened the door for these wolves. Jack looked up for a second, his face smeared with grease. "Help me, Eli. For God's sake, help me." But Eli just turned away, walking toward the edge of the dock as if he could disappear into the fog. The repair was holding, but it was fragile. Jack needed a professional, someone with a vacuum pump and a fresh charge of refrigerant. He ran to the office and grabbed the ancient rotary phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number for Old Man Calloway's son, the best fridge tech in the county. He waited for the dial tone, but there was only a hollow, dead silence. He clicked the receiver over and over, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He traced the wire out the window and saw it. The main line had been cut clean, the copper ends gleaming in the sun. He was isolated. No phone, no help, just the ticking clock of the rising temperature. He went to the boat, the rusty anchor, seeking some kind of solace in the familiar wood and the smell of diesel. He needed to check the bilge, to make sure they hadn't sabotaged the hull, too. He crawled into the tight space under the deck, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. That's when he saw it. A small, black plastic box with a blinking red light, magnetically attached to the steel frame of the engine mount. A GPS tracker. They weren't just watching the shack, they were hunting him. They knew every fishing spot, every secret cove, every move he made on the water. The paranoia settled in his bones, cold and heavy. He wasn't a fisherman anymore. He was a target. The festival was starting. The first few tourists were trickling onto the pier, lured by the scent of frying clams and the promise of fresh lobster. But before the crowd could grow, a corporate security guard, a man even larger than Vince, approached the main entrance gate. He carried a heavy length of rusted chain and a massive padlock. Without a word, he began wrapping the chain around the gate posts, his movements slow and deliberate. He was shutting the world out, turning the rusty anchor into a prison. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jack roared, sprinting across the gravel. The guard didn't even look up. "Property is a safety hazard," he said, his voice a flat, rehearsed monotone. "Closed for public access until further notice." Jack didn't think. He didn't weigh the consequences. He reached for the nearest tool, a heavy iron gaff leaning against a bait crate. He swung it with the strength of 20 years of hauling nets, the hook catching the chain and wrenching it out of the guard's hands. The brawl was short, brutal, and played out in the mud and the salt spray. The guard swung a heavy fist, catching Jack across the jaw, but Jack didn't go down. He used the gaff as a lever, tripping the man and pinning him against the fence. They rolled in the muck, the sounds of grunts and the dull thud of blows echoing off the side of the shack. Jack was older, slower, but he was fueled by a primal, desperate rage. He managed to get a grip on the man's throat, his calloused fingers digging into the soft tissue. "This is my home," Jack hissed, his face inches from the guards. "You do not lock me out of my own life." He wrenched the padlock away and threw it into the harbor, the splash the only sound in the sudden silence. He found Eli in the back office, hunched over the small desk, his head in his hands. Jack slammed the door shut, the sound like a gunshot. "Bank statements," Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Show me the bank statements, Eli, now." Eli didn't fight him. He was too broken for that. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers, his hands shaking so hard the pages rattled. Jack scanned them, his eyes widening as he saw the withdrawals. Thousands of dollars, gone in a single night. Then another and another. "Poker," Eli whispered, the word barely audible. "It was just one bad night, Jack. Then I tried to win it back. I thought I could fix it before you noticed." The truth spilled out like a gutting, the secret games in the back of the pool hall, the mounting debts to men who didn't take no for an answer, the crushing weight of a life built on a lie. Eli had been drowning long before Atlantic Harvest showed up. Sterling hadn't just found a weak point. He'd found a man who was already underwater. Sterling paid it, Eli continued, his voice flat and dead. He called it earnest money. A down payment on the shack. He said it would clear my debts, keep me alive. I didn't have a choice, Jack. They were going to kill me. The betrayal was complete. Eli hadn't just signed a paper. He'd taken the bribe. He'd sold the only thing they had left to save his own skin. Jack looked at the man he had called brother and saw a stranger, a coward who had traded 20 years of loyalty for a few hands of cards. The final blow came when Jack realized the legal implications. The earnest money contract was a trap. According to the fine print, if the debt wasn't repaid in full by the end of the festival, the deed would automatically and irrevocably transfer to Atlantic Harvest. There was no 30-day grace period. There was no appeal. The clock was already ticking. Jack looked at the kitchen timer on the wall, a simple plastic device they used for the lobster boils. He reached out and set it for 36 hours. The loud, rhythmic tick-tick-tick filled the room, a mechanical heartbeat marking the end of everything. The festival opened with a roar. A sea of tourists, bright-eyed and hungry, flooded the docks, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the grim silence inside the shack. Jack was behind the grill, his movements mechanical, his mind focused on the goal. Every lobster sold, every basket of clams, every beer was a few more dollars toward the impossible total. He didn't look at Eli. He didn't look at the thugs who were still lurking at the edge of the property. He just cooked. The heat from the grill was a physical weight, the steam from the pots rising in thick, salty clouds. The rhythm was broken by the arrival of a man in a crisp white shirt, accompanied by Mr. Sterling. The man held a legal document with the bank's official seal. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Due to the breach of contract and the instability of the business, the bank is calling in the entirety of your outstanding loan. Immediate full repayment is required by sunset today. Failure to comply will result in the immediate seizure of all assets." Sterling stood behind him, his gray eyes shining with a cold, triumphant light. He had tightened the noose. The festival revenue wouldn't be enough. They needed the whole balance, and they needed it now. The pressure intensified an hour later. Jack went to the phone to call his primary supplier, a man he'd done business with for 15 years, only to be told that they were out of stock. He called the next one, and the next. The answer was always the same. "Sorry, Jack. Orders from the top. We can't sell to you." Sterling had used Atlantic Harvest's massive corporate leverage to choke off the supply chain. The Rusty Anchor was a seafood shack with no seafood. The crowd was growing, the line stretching out toward the street, and Jack had nothing to give them. He stood on the deck, looking out at the harbor, feeling the weight of the defeat. But then he saw them. A fleet of small, weathered fishing boats, the kind that had been the backbone of Gloucester for a century, were heading toward his dock. Old Man Calloway, Maria the Shark, Tommy Two Fingers, they were all there. They began unloading crates of fresh, snapping lobsters directly onto Jack's pier. "Heard you were having some trouble with the big guys," Maria said, her voice a rough, beautiful growl. "The sea don't belong to corporations, Jack, and neither do we." It was a lifeline, a surge of solidarity that brought a lump to Jack's throat. The kitchen became a war zone of efficiency. Jack and Eli, forced together by the sheer volume of the work, found their old rhythm. They didn't speak, but they moved like parts of a single machine. Jack handled the grills, his hands moving through the heat with practiced ease, while Eli prepped the plates and handled the orders. The piles of cash in the register grew, a mountain of crumpled 5s and 10s that represented the collective support of the town. For a few hours, it felt like they might actually make it. The tick-tick-tick of the timer was drowned out by the sizzle of the grill and the roar of the crowd. Sterling wasn't finished. He signaled to a group of his security team, men who looked more like street brawlers than guards. They pushed their way into the crowded kitchen area, knocking over stacks of napkins and insulting the customers. "Safety hazard," one of them shouted, kicking a bucket of ice across the floor. "This place is a fire trap. Everyone out." They were trying to provoke a reaction, to create enough chaos to justify calling in the sheriff and shutting the whole thing down. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand and a ladle of scalding oil in the other. "Back off!" he roared, his voice cutting through the din. When one of the thugs reached for the grill, Jack swung the skillet, the heavy metal connecting with the man's ribs with a sickening crack. He flicked the hot oil at the others, the sizzling droplets forcing them back. It was a desperate, ugly defense, played out in front of a horrified crowd of tourists. The brawl spilled onto the deck, chairs overturning, people screaming as they scrambled to get away. The violence was the final nail in the coffin. The crowd began to flee, the joyful energy of the festival replaced by a sharp, jagged fear. Jack stood in the center of the deck, chest heaving, the skillet still in his hand. He looked around at the empty tables and the scattered food, realizing that Sterling had won. He had discredited the rusty anchor, turned it into a place of danger and chaos. The revenue stream was gone, the deadline was looming, and the town's support had been shattered by the very violence he'd used to protect it. In the sudden, hollow quiet, Eli finally broke. He slumped against the counter, his face buried in his hands. "I gave it to them, Jack," he sobbed. "The deed. The original physical deed. Sterling's lawyers, they came to the house last night. They said if I didn't hand it over, they'd make sure I never walked again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The revelation was the cold, hard end of the road. Without the physical deed, Jack had no legal standing. He was a man fighting for a house that someone else already held the keys to. Sterling stepped forward, holding a single sheet of paper. "As of 10 minutes ago," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm, "this property has been officially transferred to Atlantic Harvest. Mr. Callahan, you are now legally a trespasser. I suggest you and Mr. Turner leave immediately before I have the sheriff remove you by force." He looked at the mountain of cash in the register and smiled. "Keep the money, Jack. You're going to need it for a good lawyer, though I suspect it won't be enough." Jack stood on the deck as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the waves in shades of bruised purple and gold. He looked at the cash, then at the empty shack, then at the man who had been his brother. He had won the battle of the festival. The money was there, more than enough to pay the debt. But he had lost the war for the land. He was a king of a kingdom of salt and shadows, standing on a pier that no longer belonged to him. The silence of the harbor was louder than any storm he'd ever faced. The next morning, the sound of a diesel engine, much larger and more industrial than any fishing boat, woke Jack from a fitful sleep on the office floor. He ran to the window and saw it. A massive yellow crane, its arm stretched out like a skeletal finger, positioned at the edge of the pier. The Atlantic Harvest logo was plastered on the side. Without a word of warning, the crane's hook descended, snagging the corner of the rusty anchor's sign. With a sickening screech of tearing wood and shattering neon, the sign was ripped from its moorings. Jack watched as his father's name was dragged through the air, the red letters rusty, snapping in half. It was a public execution, a deliberate act of desecration designed to break his spirit. He stood in the wreckage of his office, the tick-tick-tick of the kitchen timer finally reaching zero with a sharp, tinny ding. He was at rock bottom, humiliated, broke, and technically a criminal on his own land. But as he looked at the shattered neon on the gravel, something shifted. The grief didn't vanish, but it hardened into something useful. He remembered the long winters his father had spent hunched over old books, teaching Jack that the sea was governed by laws as old as the tides. He dove into the dusty box under the desk, pulling out tattered volumes of maritime law and hand-drawn zoning maps from the 1950s. He worked with a feverish intensity, his mind racing through decades of local history. He wasn't looking for a miracle, he was looking for a technicality. And then he found it, a small, obscure clause in the 1974 Coastal Heritage Act. The rusty anchor wasn't just a shack. It was built on one of the original wooden piers from the 1880s, a structure designated as a maritime heritage site. According to the law, any industrial demolition or structural alteration to such a site required a mandatory 90-day public hearing and an environmental impact study. Sterling's crane was a direct violation of federal law. Jack grabbed the books and his old truck keys, ignoring the thugs who tried to block his path. He had a new weapon, and it wasn't a skillet. The race to the courthouse was a blur of skipped red lights and screeching tires. He burst into the clerk's office, a man smelling of salt and desperation, demanding to see a judge. He battled through a wall of bureaucratic indifference, his voice rising as he cited chapter and verse of the Heritage Act. It took 3 hours, 2 shouting matches, and a frantic call to a retired lawyer who owed his father a favor. But finally, he got it. A signed emergency injunction, stamped with the seal of the Commonwealth. He arrived back at the docks just as the crane was positioning itself to take a bite out of the roof. "Stop!" Jack screamed, sprinting across the planks, the paper held high like a flag. The operator hesitated, the massive engine idling with a low growl. Sterling stepped out of his car, his face a mask of irritation. "This is over, Jack. Don't make this any more pathetic than it already is." Jack didn't say a word. He just handed him the injunction. He watched as Sterling's eyes scanned the page, the man's polished composure finally cracking. The silver hair seemed to dull, the sharp jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. "This is a delay, nothing more," Sterling hissed. But he signaled the crane operator to shut down. The sudden silence was beautiful. Jack didn't stop there. He went back to the earnest money contract, his eyes focusing on the routing numbers for the payment Eli had received. He spent the next 4 hours at the local library, using their ancient computer to trace the digital trail. It wasn't an offshore account in the Caymans. It was a shell company registered to a business park in the next town over. A business park owned by the mayor of Gloucester. The realization hit him like a rogue wave. This wasn't just corporate greed. It was a local conspiracy. The mayor had been taking kickbacks from Atlantic Harvest to facilitate the redevelopment of the waterfront, using the bank's foreclosure as a smokescreen. The payment to Eli wasn't earnest money. It was an illegal bribe designed to bypass the public bidding laws for heritage sites. Jack took the evidence, the routing numbers, the shell company filings, and the falsified property values, directly to the High Sheriff, a man who had known Jack's father for 40 years. The fallout was spectacular. Jack didn't wait for the slow wheels of justice to turn. He led the sheriff and a small army of local fishermen to the mayor's office during a public town hall meeting. He laid the documents on the podium, his voice echoing through the chamber as he exposed the rot at the heart of the town. The community, already simmering with resentment toward the corporate takeover, erupted. The mayor was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face a mask of sweating terror. The legal victory followed swiftly. A judge, faced with clear evidence of fraud and bribery, voided the deed transfer and froze Atlantic Harvest's assets in the harbor pending a federal investigation. The rusty anchor was back in Jack's hands, the deed returned to its rightful place in the scarred wooden desk. But the victory felt hollow. He stood on the dock as Sterling and his team were forced to pack their gear, the corporate sharks finally retreating into the shadows. The community cheered, but Jack's eyes were on the bus station at the end of the street. Eli was there, sitting on a hard plastic bench, a single duffel bag at his feet. He had the remaining cash from the festival in a thick envelope, enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere where the smell of salt didn't remind him of his own cowardice. Jack walked up to him, the two men standing in the shadow of the morning sun. There were 1,000 things to say. About 20 years of friendship, about the night the boat sank, about the cards and the lies. But in the end, there was only silence. "You're leaving," Jack said, his voice a flat, tired rasp. Eli didn't look up. "I can't stay here, Jack. Every time I look at the water, I see what I did. I see the man I became." He stood up, the bus pulling into the station with a hiss of air brakes. He handed Jack the envelope of cash. "Keep it. For the repairs. For the sign." He stepped onto the bus without a backward glance, his silhouette disappearing behind the tinted glass. Jack watched the bus pull away, the red taillights fading into the distance, realizing that he had saved the wood and the brine, but he had lost the brother he had fought to save. At dawn the next day, the harbor was a mirror of silver and gray. Jack stood on the deck of the rusty anchor. The new sign, a simple piece of plywood with his father's name painted in bold, black letters, hanging crookedly above the door. He picked up his knife and a fresh cod, the familiar weight of the steel a comfort in the cold morning air. He was alone. The silence was heavy, the only sound the rhythmic slap of the waves against the pilings. He made the first cut, the wet thunk echoing across the empty dock. Another day, another catch, another life. The sea was still there, vast and unyielding, the only partner he had left. He began the morning routine, one slice at a time, moving forward into the quiet.